Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister was on top of his brief, perhaps he'd be able to answer some questions. Given this crazy decision, he talks about a decision made under the last government. It was not made by the last government, it was made by the courts. The issue we are discussing today is about judicial decisions. We cannot be in a situation where we allow enormous numbers of people to exploit our laws in this way. There are millions of people all around the world in terrible situations. We cannot help them all, and we certainly cannot bring them all here. Will he commit to bringing forward that new legislation or amending his borders bill?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've already said the Home Secretary has already got a team working on closing this loophole. We don't need to wait for that. We're getting on with that because we're taking control. They lost control of immigration. We had nearly 1 million people come into this country, had an open borders experiment. On a Monday of this week, they voted against increased powers to deal with those that are running the vile trade of people smuggling. Same old Tories, open borders, empty promises.
Mr. Speaker.
Kemi Badenoch just took Keir Starmer to task, leaving him visibly rattled. From sharp comebacks to brutal takedowns, this exchange had everything. Let's break down how it all unfolded. From the start, Starmer and Labour claimed to be driving growth, but Kemi Badenoch exposed the truth. His actions are slowing the economy down.
Kemi Badenoch.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservative government established the Ukraine Family Scheme. And in total, over 200,000 Ukrainians, mostly women, children and the elderly, have found sanctuary in the UK from Putin's war. However, a family of 6 from Gaza have applied to live in Britain using this scheme, and a judge has now ruled in their favour. This is not what the scheme was designed to do. This decision is completely wrong. It cannot be allowed to stand. Is the government planning to appeal on any points of law? And if so, which ones?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. I do not agree with the decision. She's right. It's the wrong decision. She hasn't quite done her homework because the decision in question was taken under the last government according to the legal framework of the last government. But, Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. It should be Parliament that makes the rules on immigration. It should be the government that makes the policy. That is the principle, and the Home Secretary is already looking at the legal loophole which we need to close in this particular case.
Mr. Speaker, he didn't.
Starmer and Badenoch clashed over the employment bill, which she argued would cost businesses $5 billion and hurt small firms. Calling it an unemployment bill, her criticism was so sharp that the Speaker had to step in. Last week, Starmer misled the House, failing to grasp his own education bill. The Speaker reminded MPs they couldn't directly accuse the Prime Minister of misleading Parliament. But what was the issue? What did Starmer push that helps lawyers, not businesses? And what did Badenoch expose that left him furious yet powerless to respond?
Not answer the question. If he plans to appeal, then the appeal may be unsuccessful and the law will need to be changed. And if he does not appeal, the law definitely will need to be changed. He talks about a decision made under the last government. It was not made by the last government, it was made by the courts. The issue we are discussing today is about judicial decisions. We cannot be in a situation where we allow enormous numbers of people to exploit our laws in this way. There are millions of people all around the world in terrible situations. We cannot help them all, and we certainly cannot bring them all here. Will he commit to bringing forward that new legislation or amending his borders bill?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've already said the Home Secretary has already got a team working on closing this loophole. We don't need to wait for that. We're getting on with that because we're taking control. They lost control of immigration. We had nearly 1 million people come into this country, had an open borders experiment. On a Monday of this week, they voted against increased powers to deal with those that are running the vile trade of people smuggling. Same old Tories, open borders, empty promises.
Kemi Badenoch's clash with Keir Starmer at Prime Minister's questions dealt a major blow to Labour. It wasn't just a heated exchange, it was a direct takedown of their economic policies, shattering the narrative Starmer had spent a year building. Even former Labour supporters like Chef Tom Kerridge, who backed the party during the election, have slammed this budget as catastrophic. For months, Labour has claimed to be the party of economic stability. Starmer and Rachel Reeves have presented themselves as the solution to years of Conservative mismanagement, promising businesses growth and confidence after a decade of turbulence.
Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister was on top of his brief, perhaps he'd be able to answer some questions. Given this crazy decision and so many others, new legislation is needed to clarify the right to a family life in Article 8. I'm not talking about what he just said. I know Labour MPs don't understand much of what they're saying, but the Prime Minister literally wrote a book on the European Convention on Human Rights. This is a situation where we need to put our national interest before the ECHR. Does he agree that we should legislate even if lawyers warn that this might be incompatible with human rights law?
She complains about scripted answers and questions. Her script doesn't allow her to listen to the answer.
Prime Minister.
She asked me if we're going to change the law and close the loophole in question 1. I said yes. She asked me again in question 2, and I said yes. She asked me again in question 3. It's still yes.
Mr. Speaker.
The Prime Minister's arrogance is clear. He believes his government creates growth, but he's wrong. Growth comes from businesses, entrepreneurs, and hard-working people. You can't tax, borrow, or legislate your way to a stronger economy. While other countries cut red tape, Trump did it in the US. Argentina is deregulating, and even the EU isn't this extreme. Labour is doing the opposite. This bill, combined with the jobs tax and family business tax, is driving wealth creators out of Britain.
Okay, he didn't listen to question 1. I asked if he would appeal the decision. He did not answer that. He's not listening. He's too busy defending the international human rights law framework. Mr. Speaker, this case has arisen because a Palestinian came to the UK from Gaza in 2007. He is now a British citizen. This is precisely why we need to break the conveyor belt from arriving in the UK to acquiring indefinite leave to remain, and then a British passport, and now a right to bring 6 family members here as well. Just last week, the Prime Minister bizarrely claimed that a British passport was not a pull factor for those coming to the UK. Will he now support our plans to toughen the process on indefinite leave to remain and make getting a British passport a privilege, not a right?
Prime Minister.
Speaker, they presided over record high levels of immigration. It reached nearly 1 million. It was a one-nation experiment in open borders. And she was the cheerleader. She was the one campaigning for more people to come and thanking her own side when they supported her campaign. So before she lectures us, I think she needs to reflect on her own record and her own record here.
The Chancellor is scrambling to save her reputation, knowing Labour has hurt growth. This bill fails the Prime Minister's own growth test. So, if he won't drop the unemployment bill, what's the point of his so-called test? Badenoch tore apart Labour's claims, exposing both flaws and contradictions in their policies. Their so-called pro-worker employment rights bill turned out to be a massive burden on businesses, failing even Starmer's own growth test.
Prime Minister now. The people out there want to know what he is going to do about the situation. He needs to spend less time whining about the last government and do his job. I thought, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister and I both agreed that Israel had a right to defend herself. Yet the judge in this case noted that the family were facing a humanitarian crisis, and I quote, as a consequence of the Israeli government's indiscriminate attempts to eliminate Hamas, and government lawyers accepted this. Is the Prime Minister allowing lawyers to change the position on Israel? And was this because of advice from the Attorney General? And if not, why on earth did government lawyers accept the argument that Israeli actions were indiscriminate?
Prime Minister.
They put the complete opposite argument. She talks about on top of her breath. She has no idea what she's talking about. I'll tell her again. We need to change the law. That's why the Home Secretary is already closing the gap. I know the script doesn't allow any adaptation, but this is getting tedious.
Kemi Badenoch.
Badenoch's main point was the stark economic reality of the Employment Rights Bill. Labour's own analysis estimated it would cost businesses $5 billion a year, an undeniable figure from their own policy calculations. The Federation of Small Businesses, FSB, sounded the alarm, with 92% of small business owners deeply concerned about the bill's impact. Their biggest issue? The first 6 clauses, which they warned would make hiring riskier and more costly.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has not read the judgment. I suggest that he does. There are very serious questions now. There are very serious questions now being asked about the Attorney General, the Prime Minister's personal friend and donor. Even Labour ministers are concerned. One Labour peer, Lord Glassman, has called him the absolute archetype of an arrogant progressive fool. If we are serious about protecting our borders, we need to make sure we appoint people who believe in our country and everything we stand for. It is not clear the Attorney General does. The government is now recruiting a new Chief Inspector of Borders who lives in Finland and wants to work from home. This is not serious. Why should the British public put up with this?
Prime Minister.
The individual in question was appointed in 2019 by the last government to a senior position. He then worked for 5 years from Finland. We've changed that, and he's now going to be working from the United Kingdom full-time. Finland under them. And she talks about the Attorney General. She sat round the cabinet table with an attorney who was later sacked for breaching national security.
One major problem was the new statutory sick pay rule, forcing companies to pay employees from day one of illness, scrapping the current waiting period. While framed as a pro-worker policy, it would place a heavy financial burden on small and medium-sized businesses. Another major issue is the bill's new flexible working requirements, which force employers to justify any refusal. While intended to support workers, this rule adds layers of bureaucracy and increases compliance burdens for businesses. Instead of focusing on productivity and growth, employers will now have to navigate additional paperwork and legal hurdles, making hiring decisions even more complicated.
Mr. Speaker, our plan for change delivers the biggest upgrade in workers' rights in a generation for our employment rights bill. Ending exploitative zero-hour contracts, ending the scandal of fire and rehire, extending statutory sick pay to 1.3 million employees. Of course, that's on top of the pay rise for 3 million of the lowest paid. I would have thought the Leader of the Opposition might actually sort of support day one protection employment rights, given where she's going, but she thinks maternity leave is excessive. Our plan is pro-worker and pro-growth.
Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Badenoch.
Beyond the costs, it also raises legal risks. Businesses could face lawsuits soon after hiring, making them more cautious about expanding their workforce, especially when hiring from groups they fear could bring legal challenges. Badenoch didn't hold back. This bill is an adventure playground for lawyers. It's terrible for businesses, but great for the legal profession. The Prime Minister needs to stop being a lawyer and start being a leader.
On what we already know. We already know, myself from personal knowledge when I was Chief Prosecutor, that warped ideas, myths and stereotypes about victims were at the heart of this. We've known that for a decade. The Jay report called for mandatory reporting. I called for it 11 years ago. What we need now is action. What can't be tolerated is the idea that this afternoon members opposite will vote down a bill which protects children, including include, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, let me just. One of the provisions in the bill is to protect children vulnerable today who are out of school to prevent abusers ever taking those children out of school. I implore members opposite to defy the misleading leadership of the Leader of the Opposition and vote for a really important bill.
Her point was clear and politically damning. If hiring becomes riskier, businesses will hire less, and that's already happening. When pressed on whether the bill would cause job losses, Starmer had no real answer. Instead, he relied on vague rhetoric about dignity and workers' rights, ignoring how businesses would afford these costly regulations. Badenoch made her point clear. Starmer lacks an economic strategy, real answers, and credibility.
I've watched a lot of Prime Minister's questions in my time in the chamber and outside of it. And the weird thing about the sort of Starmer-Badenoch years, if it ends up running to years, which after performances like that I think becomes less and less likely, is, Natasha, I think it's almost as if it's this sort of slightly weird dance where they both just, instead of actually even, I mean, insofar as Prime Minister's questions is ever a debate about policy or even politics, it becomes very formalistic. They basically spend it accusing each other of not being entirely up to date or not understanding whatever it is that they're talking about, which more than anything makes it seem more futile than ever and very, very boring.
Yeah, and usually Keir Starmer could be accused of not answering the questions from Kemi Badenoch properly, but I think this time she probably couldn't say that, but decided to go ahead on her script anyway of, well, you're not answering the question, and him saying, you're not listening to my answers. It just feels like they're actually having two separate Prime Minister's questions sessions, doesn't it?
You haven't done your homework. No, you haven't done your homework.
No, you're not listening. No, you're not answering. No, you're not listening. And it just feels a little bit tedious, but I think...
What do you think? Should Starmer scrap the clauses that encourage legal battles between employees and employers? Did Labour mislead the public with promises of growth and stability? Like and subscribe for more videos like this, and we'll see you in the next video.